Welcome to the Unmasking Podcast with your hosts, Cindy and Sarah. I'm Cindy, a licensed professional counselor and certified yoga instructor.
And I'm Sarah, a licensed professional counselor and registered play therapist. Together, we're on a mission to spread mental health awareness and cultivate connection by talking about the ways in which we can unmask ourselves to create a more authentic life.
Let's unmask.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to Unmasking with Cindy and Sarah. We are so excited to have you here on our first series that we will be doing on trauma. So we will have a few episodes talking about big trauma versus little trauma, PTSD versus complex PTSD. But before we get started on that, we wanted to also remind everyone to please take care of yourself. There are some very intense topics that can come up with trauma. You yourself could feel a certain way about certain topics. And so we want you to be mindful to take care of yourself. That's extremely important. So please practice self-care and be mindful if at any time you're uncomfortable or something has triggered you, please take care of yourself. That is the whole reason we are here. Help us unmask, but also be true to ourselves. So if anything comes up for you, sit with it, see why that's making you feel that way, and then practice the self-care that you need. So before we get started talking with Cindy today, our kind of trauma guru, who this is really her area of expertise, she's going to talk a little bit more about the difference between a big trauma versus a little trauma, and how that can affect everyone in different kinds of ways. I was going to go into a little bit about the origins of unmasking, where it originally started from in the mid 1500s. And that was just the Oxford English Dictionary defines it as to reveal the true nature of something or someone, or to expose your true character. This can be seen in Shakespeare times, which is, where there's outer appearance versus inner reality. You're seeing tragedy and Much Ado About Nothing. Really, most of Shakespeare's plays had a lot of masking. Romeo and Juliet, Star-Crossed Lovers, everybody really knows that one. But he uses these as quite a big theme. And when the mask is taken off, it kind of villainizes the person, right? We see that a lot. And then in modern day, we see that when you look at Scooby-Doo, at the end, they're always unmasking the villain. And it's always someone that you did not suspect.
Yes.
But the mask really had a negative connotation, very villainized to unmask, and it was negative for the person. But what Cindy and I are looking at is more from a mental health perspective of unmasking in a positive way. And if you look at Every Mind at Work, it's a great organization. And I'm going to read a little bit from their work that they're doing, because they have a lot of the same ideas that we have. But masking is a process by which an individual changes or masks their true feelings to conform to social pressures or to shield themselves from inspection. A simple example of this might be smiling on the outside, but you're really feeling sad on the inside. There is a lot of shame when it comes to masking and mental health. So that is a big theme that Cindy and I would like to work on, is the shame aspect of why do we put a mask on? What is causing that in our life subjectively? Because it's different for everybody, right? So people mask their mental health for many reasons. A lot of those could be due to discrimination. So we're talking about, a lot of racial trauma here. I think of Passing. It's a novel by Nella Larson. I took African-American literature when I was in undergrad. I was an English minor, so that was one of the classes I chose to take. And we read this book, and it was one of the most beautiful books I have ever read. It was about two friends, Claire and Irene. And Claire was adopted by her two white aunts, and she was very fair. So she passed as a white woman, married a white man who was a bigot and racist. And her friend Irene lived in Harlem, very authentic to herself. So it shows the difference between someone who is masking and someone who is unmasking, and the complexities of that relationship. And that is a very good example of how racial trauma can trigger the need to mask. There's also rejection. we mask because we don't want to feel rejected, so we want to fit in with others, and or having judgment caused by the stigma associated with having something going on with mental health. Like, so you see that with high functioning, or I want to say now I want to be more mindful of very low needs autism. So somebody who's considered high functioning, everybody functions. So I'm going to say low needs versus high needs. So someone with very low needs can tend to fit in with everyone else based on watching people, observing, taking in their behaviors, and then just modeling those behaviors themselves. So that is a one. Also ADHD, there can be huge stigmas with that. So lots of, depressed on the inside, but acting happy on the outside, lots of these different topics. So that's what we're, again, looking at is the mental health aspect. But it's interesting when you look at how villainized it was to unmask back in the day. But really, we're coming from a place of being true to yourself, being authentic to yourself, and again, that theme of wanting to take the shame away. So to get started today, I'm very excited. We have Cindy, who is going to be talking about trauma. So we have big traumas and little traumas, and we want to just be mindful that masking is a response to trauma. So it's something that naturally occurs to protect yourself, right? So I am going to hand over the mic to my lovely colleague, Cindy, so she can introduce this beautiful topic to us.
Awesome. So glad to be back. And yes, so Sarah and I were talking about this before we started recording, and I also an English minor. I didn't know that about you, but I didn't think about it like that, with like the Shakespearean times and how there was, typically a mask or, more currently with like Scooby-Doo. But you're right, even just how it's portrayed in shows, in literature, that masking is really this way to kind of cover something that you don't want other people to see. And it can also be just really villainized. And also, Sarah, I'm going to ask if you can link that book to that you were mentioning. What was it called?
It was called Passing by Nella Larson.
Passing.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. It sounds. Yeah.
Oh, I don't mean to cut off. I was just going to say, Cindy and I are in the process of getting our website up, and we will also have a virtual bookshelf with all of the resources from all of the different books. Cindy's going to be introducing some beautiful books today, and all of that will be on there. So yes, I am glad to link all of these different things so that everyone has the resources.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. It sounds really fascinating. And I'm reading a book right now actually called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts. And it's by Resmaa Menakem. Hope I'm not mispronouncing his name, but we can throw that in there as well. But yeah, just to start at the very beginning with trauma. Trauma is something that has always really intrigued me. I have, as I shared in my episode, I have a personal connection to it. And oftentimes when we're talking about trauma, I think that can be such a heavy topic for people that maybe they feel like right away they don't identify as someone who has experienced trauma. But really, no matter who you are, what your social class is, what your race is, what your heritage is, like everyone has had trauma in their life. And so what I really wanted to do today is just introduce a basic definition of trauma and where that comes from, just so that everybody can kind of understand what it means to have trauma. What are we talking about here with trauma? So the author that I mentioned, Resmaa Menakem, he talks about trauma as really anything that happens too fast, too soon for our brain and our body to catch up to. And so if you look at it from that lens, we've all experienced situations that have happened too fast, too soon for our brain and our body to process. When I first started really educating myself about trauma, I read a book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And he really is the trauma guru, I think, in the mental health field.
Love that book.
Oh, it's such a great read. If you haven't checked that out and you're curious about understanding trauma and how it's stored in our body, which again, as Sarah mentioned, we'll get into the body piece of it in later episodes. Check that out. And so he talks about trauma as being very common, and it isn't what happens to you, but how you respond to the traumatic situation itself. And so I'll use a car accident as an example. It's not the car accident itself that is the traumatizing experience, but rather what happens in the moments right after the car accident. So recognizing that what just happened to you happened, taking the seatbelt off, walking away from the crash, hearing the sirens, seeing the images, that's the trauma that gets trapped in our bodies and stored in our bodies. And so I really thought that was an interesting way to distinguish the event itself from the aftermath. And so trauma is also a really subjective experience. You can be in a room with another human being that's experiencing trauma, and it might not be traumatizing to you. But to that individual, given their background and their history and what they're already bringing to the table, they can experience that as traumatizing. And so that's just really important to distinguish, that right out of the gate. You mentioned, Sarah, like little T trauma and big T trauma. And, I want to kind of give some examples. And Sarah, feel free to chime in at any time, with something that might make sense, that I don't bring up. But little T traumas versus big T traumas, oftentimes, like when I have a client come in and we're talking about their history, we will hit these big events that, if I were to turn on the news and hear a story about somebody who has experienced horrific abuse, or they were part of a natural disaster or a car accident, like I mentioned, like a single isolated event that everyone could agree, gosh, that's traumatic for the people that are going through it. And it could be individual or it could be a collective trauma. COVID obviously was traumatic. That was a collective trauma for us because everything shut down and we had to adjust to this new way of living. People lost their jobs, people lost loved ones, even going out in public in a mask. That's traumatizing. And so that is what we would call a big T trauma, single isolated event that people experience either individually or collectively. But these little T traumas are the ones I think that a lot of people might not recognize them as traumas, but they are indeed traumas. And so small T traumas are events that exceed our capacity to cope, and they cause a disruption in our emotional functioning. And so these are distressing events that are not typically inherently like life-threatening, or but perhaps they are better described as threatening to the ego due to the individual feeling a sense of helplessness. And so when you think of it like that, what is something, Sarah, that comes up for you with little T versus big T?
So here's how I would look at it from a child's perspective. New to a school, came from like maybe you're going into 6th grade, new to a middle school.
Yeah.
First time going into that middle school. That could be traumatic, right?
Yeah.
That would be considered maybe like a little T trauma.
Yes.
Big T trauma would be you are a foster child that has been moved from school to school to school. You've never had any real roots and you've been in abusive situations. I would say that would be considered more of a big trauma. So the big trauma, I don't know if that makes sense. The little one is just, it's traumatic. You're new to a school. It's a little trauma, but you're a foster kid who already doesn't have your biological parents. You have visitation, you have other things going on, and you're moving from school to school constantly trying to get over. To me, that seems more like a big trauma.
That's actually a really great example to think about it from a relational standpoint, because that's an example of somebody coming in with a previous trauma history, probably. And
okay, so
we can,
again is not the correct. Is that the correct
no
way with trauma? Okay.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because again, it doesn't necessarily have to be a single isolated event, but
Mm-hmm.
it could involve things like a sense of safety. If you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if that person doesn't have a secure home base or a sense of safety, then they're already walking in with more odds stacked against them. So they're going to have more protective mechanisms, and they probably mask to a more extreme degree.
Okay.
You mentioned rejection. And I want to go back to that and talk a little bit more about that with shame and how that can lead to a trauma response. And so when we think about fitting in versus belonging, we are all the time as social creatures looking at situations and trying to decide where we fit in, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so if you look at that from like a physiological standpoint, if I'm walking up to a group of people and they give me a subtle look that tells my nervous system, that sends a message to my brain that like I don't fit in here, I'm going to feel maybe a sense of embarrassment, um, the need to hide or to say something, to
Mm-hmm.
try to gain access to the group, right? And what's happening in all of those little nuanced interactions is an awareness. My body is aware that, like, something's not right here. So my heart could beat faster, which causes higher levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, right? Or if something embarrassing happens to me and I'm called out or I'm humiliated, that's going to create a shame response. And a shame response is actually the same response that our bodies have when we're in a situation where it's fight, flight, or freeze. So it registers in our brain and our nervous system as fear based. And so that is traumatic, right? Because again, go back to the definition of these are things that are happening too soon, too fast for my brain and my body to catch up with. And so, how am I going to cope with that? I'm going to do something to protect myself from being vulnerable, which in turn can create even more shame because I'm aware that I'm doing
Yeah.
it, right? So we see how it becomes really cyclical in nature and it just kind of starts to stack up. So when I ask clients, have you ever experienced anything that sticks out to you that's traumatizing? We really sometimes have to go a little bit deeper than
Mm-hmm.
just the surface level things that we have to list out on paper. I had a surgery, or there was a house fire, or there was, COVID or a car accident. And I don't want to discount those because those are absolutely life changing events as well. But I wonder if sometimes, what you and I are talking about are more of the little t everyday
Mm-hmm.
things that
Yeah.
happen, right? That add up. Does that make sense?
1000%. And that made me think about empathy and
Mm,
how something that is so subjective. So if
mm-hmm.
you feel that something is very traumatizing for you,
Mm-hmm.
someone else could come along and say, well, it's not like this happened to you, or it's not like your
Yeah.
child has this, or it's not, as if you were actually in that,
Mm-hmm.
experience, something like that. I've I've personally felt that myself with having a child that is neurodivergent and
Mm-hmm.
having people say to me, well, at least she doesn't have A, B, C, or D. And it's like, but subjectively, it still affects my life and my child.
Yes.
And I think that that's okay to say with trauma, especially little trauma or little t, big T. Sorry, with little t. When you got little t up in here, when you have little t
Oh,
going on, you definitely you're allowed to. That's allowed to be traumatic for you, and it does
that's right.
affect you, and it does affect how you live your day to day life. So even though
Mm-hmm.
it may not be that you had this huge catastrophic event,
Mm-hmm.
it still affects you. And I think we need to be mindful of that as people too, that when someone tells us something saying, well, at least this, that's not helpful. That's not
No,
helpful at all. Let's
no.
just acknowledge that our friend is hurting and they need support. And I just say that because um, when Olivia was a baby, she had a lot of different things going on. And I had someone in my family say to me, well, at least
Mhm.
she doesn't have this. Like my friend has all this with her child. And I was thinking, yeah, but this has still been hard for me and
Mm.
my child. So I just want to
Mhm.
put that out there for everybody that I think empathy goes hand in hand with this, and
Yes.
that a lot of people are quick to dismiss a little T trauma
Yeah.
because it's not hugely catastrophic and it's not causing, you can still function, you can still go to work, you can still do all the things, you can still mask
Mhm.
your way through the day. It's not you're
Yes.
in your bed and can't move. And maybe that's a good way to look at it, is usually if there's a big trauma, you
Mhm.
might be in bed for days, you might be doing that.
Mhm.
But a lot of times with these little T's, you're still functioning. You're
Yes.
still out there doing this
Yes.
day to day thing and masking your way through it, but living with these. And then I guess, Cindy, you're going to talk more about this, but they just add up more and more. So the more
Mhm.
little T's you have, it probably comes out in a lot of unhealthy ways physically.
Absolutely. No, you hit a lot of good points there, because what Bessel van der Kolk says about trauma is that it changes the brain and it rewires the nervous system. And this is subtle. This isn't like an overnight thing. So it can feel hard to detect at times. And oftentimes, when I'm working with an adult who's had a lot of these little T's, um, they're coming in without the awareness of how it has changed them. And maybe they aren't even aware of a way that they had been masking. But when we can name it, we can tame it, right?
Yep.
Which that is so powerful, because we're spreading awareness that it's like, oh, wait, like this is a thing. And to your point about empathy misses. Oh gosh, we could do a whole other episode on empathy
Mm-hmm.
misses, and how, in an effort to try to comfort somebody or deal with your own discomfort about a situation, we end up making the person feel more and more alone, because we lead with the at least. And again,
Mm-hmm.
it's not coming from a place of malice 99% of the time, but it can feel really dismissive, and it can almost lead to the person second guessing themselves a lot, and so then they're having to mask even more. I mean, it's a whole thing, right? It's really difficult. And so what Brene says about empathy is that we have had it all wrong, that empathy is not the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, because let's be honest, I can't do that with
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people because I've never had that experience.
Exactly.
But empathy is believing the person. So if somebody comes to me and says, I've got this thing going on with my child, and it's so difficult for me to deal with this, and so I feel like I have to mask every time I'm out in public with my child because I'm worried about being embarrassed,
Mm-hmm.
and because I carry this deep shame that maybe it was my fault. That right there is not an invitation for me as a therapist or a friend or a family member to then say, well, but at least they're not physically sick,
Mm-hmm.
because then I'm just more isolated. What a empathetic response would be is, gosh, that's hard. Gosh, that's hard. How lonely that this must have felt for you. And what that does slowly over time, if we have more um empathy interactions with people, is it allows the nervous system to kind of start to relax a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
and your levels of cortisol are not spiked so high all the time in these social interactions, and you start to feel safe, and you start to understand the inner workings of shame, which just allows you to unmask and heal from those little T traumas.
Yeah, and I love that because it's so beautiful how you say to believe the person.
Yeah.
Because the thing about trauma and the thing about empathy is you have to voice it to someone in
Mm-hmm.
order for you to start releasing it. You have to talk about it.
Yeah.
You have to make it real and
Mm-hmm.
not just in your head, and have someone honor that from
Yes.
your perspective. And that is a difficult thing to do. That is
Mhm.
difficult for a lot of people, to listen to another person and to honor that person's feelings. But guess what? All of us have subjective feelings. And
Mhm.
and I think it's real quick for adults with children. Like, I use the example of your child's freaking out because they have a red cup, but they want the blue cup, right?
Mhm.
And you're like, a cup is a cup. But to them, that's a big deal for them. That little,
Yeah.
and I know that that doesn't have to do with trauma, but it's in the sense of it's subjective to them. So if I,
Mhm.
as an adult, say to you, my child has this going on and I'm extremely worried about my child, and I
Mhm.
say, well, at least this isn't happening, again, that's not helpful. But what
Yeah.
is helpful is saying, you're really struggling over here. This is really hard for you. I can see
Mhm.
that. How can I help? I'm here. I hear you.
Yes.
All of those things. And I think as an adult, we also wouldn't want our spouse to say to us, stop it.
Mhm.
Cup is a cup. Stop
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
It's just a teddy bear. It's just that,
Right.
get in bed. Stop. How would we
Yeah.
feel if we talked to our spouse the way we sometimes talk to our children? How would we respond to that?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so I think that was just a beautiful thing, is believing the person. I think using children is a great example of empathy, because a lot of times as adults we dismiss children and
Mhm.
we dismiss people's feelings. So I think it's a
Yes.
great example of showing that. And I love how Brene Brown has brought a lot of awareness to that.
Yeah. So
Because you're right, you
helpful.
can't be in someone else's shoes. I can't ever know what it feels like,
Mm-mm.
to be in your shoes with a situation you've experienced. But what I can do is honor it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And to take your example you just used about the cups, I think as a former um, elementary teacher, I would see examples all the time of when kids would get dysregulated about something or upset about something. And if it's not met with empathy or validation, even, um, what can happen really quickly is the child now feels embarrassed or is shamed for having a reaction to something that doesn't comply with everything that's happening around them, right? And I mean, it's embarrassment and shame are two emotions that we know have real physiological reactions. And the cortisol levels, like I'd mentioned earlier, spike. And, there's all kinds of things that are happening inside of the body, but we might not know in the moment that it's happening because it's happening so fast. And so, again, with trauma and masking, we have to think of it as this like gradual process, and we don't just learn it instantly, like, or unlearn it rather instantly. It's going to take time. And so we have to be able to know that up front, have connections with people that feel safe, I think is the first and foremost thing that we can do when we're talking about, how to heal from this. Because, okay, great. Yeah, you named it for me. And I've realized that I have this stuff, but what do I do with it now? If I know that I've experienced all these little T traumas coupled with maybe some big teeth sprinkled in there, it's great to know it. But then how do I unmask in a way that doesn't feel scary and too fast and unsafe?
Yeah, and I think that's beautiful too, because it goes into, when we mask, we are also, it not only affects our brain, but
Mm-hmm.
physically, when we take the mask off, we're physically taking it off. We're physically relaxing the body. We are
Yes.
physically helping our body get to a state that is calm.
Yeah.
And there's a lot that goes in with trauma that affects the brain, triggering the body. They work hand
Mm-hmm.
in hand, right? So if your brain is being constantly triggered, your body is going to show that physically.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that that is beautiful, how you are discussing ways that we can combat that, because physical health is very much important in our mental health and vice versa, and
Mm-hmm.
keeping us sick. And
Oh
so
yeah.
unmasking is a way for us to heal, to heal
Yeah.
and to help our bodies feel better and to help our brains, because
Mm-hmm.
all of these, I was going to ask you, and I know we're going to go more into this, but all of the little T's,
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to big T versus little T, do you notice that there's more, I guess, physically, that it's more harder on the body when there's more little T's happening because the brain is now forming, trauma after trauma after trauma? Or
Mm-hmm.
are they both the same in the way, if that makes sense? Does a big
Yeah.
trauma and tons of little traumas, do they affect us the same way? What is the difference in that?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I was thinking as you were talking, there's in that Body Keeps the Score book, there's a lot of science-based research on how it shows up in the body and over time what that does to our brain and how it's changing like our neural pathways. And yes, absolutely, we'll get into that in our next episode when we start talking about like a single isolated event versus the complex nature of when we're experiencing these things over and over and over again. And I think, with mental health, and I'm going to say something, and this might be a little controversial, but that's okay. That's what we do here, because I want to challenge a lot of these like things that we've been taught about trauma and in our bodies, because this is new research that we're finding like daily, that we used to think, oh, well, if I have this response or this thought, I can just think a new thought and I'll just do the thought replacement and then everything will be fine. And not to knock, cognitive behavioral therapy, because it's tremendously helpful with like OCD and, lots of other things, right? But what we know now is that our body experiences it first and then sends the signal to our brain. It's not the other way around. It's not the brain first, the thought first, and then the body follows. It's actually the body first and then the brain follows. So sometimes that can be a helpful way in looking at how we approach healing, because I can sit and try to use thought replacement all day long.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I have to act my way into thinking differently, not think my way into acting differently.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And I don't
Yes.
know if that really answered the question, but I think when we've got a lot of consistent, little T traumas happening, our body is in constant fight, flight, freeze mode to keep ourselves safe. And if we have enough of that over time, it will impact the way that we think about certain situations and the ways that we feel we have to keep ourselves safe and protect ourselves.
Yeah, and I look at it too as like a bucket filled with water, right? So we have two
Mm,
buckets. We have one big situation that happens that's very traumatic, or we
yeah.
have little ones that just keep getting the water poured in more and more. Eventually, that little one's going to be heavier and heavier in our body. It's going to weigh on our body so much. And I also wanted to throw in there, I know you said fight, flight, freeze. They've had a
Mm-hmm.
new one now with fawn, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
you're pleasing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I know there's lots of pleasers, raising my hand right
Yep.
here.
Yep. Recovering over here.
Yeah, no, but still the pleasing can be a big one as well. So then
Yeah.
that, again, when you're pleasing others, you're probably not being authentic to yourself. But I think that was great, and a great example of how you can
Mm-hmm.
weigh those, because I feel like, yes, a huge traumatic event can be extremely hard on the body and on the mind,
Mm-hmm.
and it can trigger lots of different things. And probably having that trauma will then trigger more little traumas if you don't work through the big trauma, which we'll go
Yeah.
into. But then also having tons of those little ones just over and over and over again, they weigh so heavy if you're
Mm-hmm.
not working through them.
Yes.
And so I'm excited to for our next episode. I think it's going to be
Yeah.
pretty cool to talk about little T versus big T, which I feel like should be like, we should have mental health rappers, little T and big T.
Great idea. Yeah. If
Yeah,
anybody, we're looking for like an intro song right now for our podcast. So if
I
anybody is
know.
in the
I'm dealing
music
with a
field that wants to
I'm dealing
wants to
with a
send
bunch of
one
little
our
T's
way.
over
No, I
here.
mean in all
Yeah. And also, I think,
in all
guys,
seriousness.
this is going to be us though. This is us. So, but I also
That's
think
right.
next episode, Cindy and I are going to also be delving into more of the brain research and talking about how there's more of the collectivistic traumas, like seeing a trauma on TV and how that affects you versus being actually
Mm-hmm.
in the trauma and experiencing it yourself. Because, like Cindy mentioned, COVID, that was a big trauma that we all experienced. But then there's also
Mm-hmm.
things like, for instance, seeing what happened to our former president last week. That was very traumatic to see. We've known as a nation, there are lots of boomers who've experienced seeing that
Mm-hmm.
through different presidencies. That can be triggering, but it affects everybody different. So do you have anything else to add today, Cindy, before I introduce our unmasking invitation?
Yeah. I think just to sum it up, if you can't remember anything from today, but just have a little nugget to take away, it's the idea that trauma is when something happens too fast, too soon for our brains and our bodies to process, and that it is a subjective experience, and that the best thing that we can do to support other people is to believe them. And it's an extremely common thing. And so masking, this is a way that, I'll just end with masking and how it ties back to that. Masking is a way that we've learned to keep ourselves safe. And there are some instances where we do still need to mask, and we'll have, again, future episodes about that, I'm sure. But like, really just to be aware of what's happening when all of this is taking place, when you're really heavily masking in a situation, and you're aware of it and it's not healthy. Could it be that it's a response to something that's happening too fast, too soon? Yeah.
Love it. Love it. And I can't get over the believe the person, because that's really what it comes down to, is having someone understand your feeling
Mm-hmm.
and your experience and believe you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that is the first episode in our series on trauma. So next week we will be back where Cindy will discuss more about complex PTSD versus regular PTSD. We're also going to bring in some more resources to discuss brain research and how it
Mm-hmm.
affects the brain and physically the body. And going into that, we're going to do our unmasking invitation for today. So, our unmasking invitation, and we will include all of this on our Instagram. There's a little template. So, feel free to go on there, please. But it is thinking about what you hide inside for yourself, different little traumas, maybe some little T's, some big T's, anything that you feel you have experienced in your life. And so on the inside of the mask, we want you to write down the emotions that you have felt from this, the thoughts and behaviors that you have, maybe the type of response you tend to have if something happens in your life, like Cindy had mentioned, fight, flight, freeze, even now the new one, fawn, any of those things that you typically hide from other people. And then next week we are going to present the mask, not you guys, but I will present my mask. And Cindy is going to do a somatic exercise to help talk about what we're holding in the brain, but how to physically calm ourselves from that. So this will be our first unmasking invitation. And all of this will be on our Instagram at Unmasked Therapist. So please like and follow us on there for more content for our psychoeducation. And then please follow, like, subscribe so that you can keep following us on our journey. We are just so glad that all of you are here, and we can't wait to get to episode 2, where we again will be diving into a whole lot more.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you
Thanks.
next
See you next
time.
time.
Welcome to the Unmasking Podcast with your host, Cindy and Sarah. I'm Cindy, a licensed professional counselor and certified yoga instructor.
And I'm Sarah, a licensed professional counselor and registered play therapist. Together, we're on a mission to spread mental health awareness and cultivate connection by talking about the ways in which we can unmask ourselves to create a more authentic life.
Let's unmask.